Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Dicey Sedgwick. We are going to be doing something slightly different for June. So instead of me simply talking about a particular topic for the episode, instead these are going to be interviews about witches and magic, because I thought that might be quite an interesting way to approach the month. So in this very first episode of this particular mini-series, I'm talking to Dr Tabitha Stanmore, who is a Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the University of Exeter on the Leverhulme-funded 7-county witch hunt project, investigating the people affected by the 1640s witch trials in Eastern England. Her doctoral research was funded by the South West and Wales Doctoral Training Partnership and published as Love Spells and Lost Treasure, Service Magic in England from the later Middle Ages to the Early Modern Era by Cambridge University Press. She has appeared on Radio 3's Free Thinking and BBC Radio London discussing magic in the early modern period, written for The Conversation and Time magazine and BBC History magazine, among others. But her debut non-fiction book, Cunning Folk, was published by the Bodley Head and Bloomsbury in 2024, and the paperback came out on the 28th of May. So in this chat, we're going to talk about what cunning folk actually are and how they differ from witches, how members of different classes approach magic and what they actually used it for, and why magic studies is such a valuable approach to history. Enjoy! Hello and welcome to Fabulous Folklore. How are you doing?
I am well, thank you. How are you?
I'm not too bad. I'm quite excited to talk to you because obviously I did get a recommendation from Marion Gibson to speak to you, and she was why I bought your book as well. Just
Oh, thanks, Marion.
for anyone watching on YouTube. Um, it won an award recently, didn't it?
It did, yeah. It won the Catherine Briggs Award, which is part of the Folklore Society's sort of annual awards, which was very exciting.
Oh, very well done. It
Thank
is an excellent book, and I will put a review at the end of this episode, separately. But as it's about cunning folk, how do you define them for people who haven't heard of them, and how do they differ from witches in the historical record?
Right. So cunning folk is quite a catch-all term. So it's kind of anybody who's practicing some kind of practical or useful magic. It's sometimes had quite strong connotations of somebody who is like quite homely and sort of uses quite basic, sort of simple spells. I use it because it's kind of easy as a term, and it can apply to lots of different practices and lots of different sort of outcomes that you can use magic for. But in the book, I'm mostly using it to refer to service magicians, who are people who had this kind of magical ability and had some spells under their belts, and they would sell those to their neighbors or their friends or kind of people further afield. And so they're slightly different, I guess, because they have a semi-professionalized aspect to them instead of your everyday person who might be a shepherd, say, but they also have a couple of spells that they use to keep their flocks going. They're different to witches in the historical context, in that people who were practicing cunning magic generally weren't accused of the kinds of dark things that witches were accused of in that period. So you wouldn't normally find cunning folk dealing with the devil, for example. You normally wouldn't see them doing harmful magic. And they didn't have that sort of dark reputation of somebody who you really want to avoid and who could sort of potentially do harm. Obviously, the word witch now kind of encompasses both of those things. You know, it can be the kind of like, evil, sold their souls to the devil, eats babies, or it can be somebody who does practical magic and is very helpful and is in touch with nature. But that is very much a kind of merging in the modern day of that term, whereas in the past, witches and cunning folk were quite separate people.
I must admit, I do love the term service magician, and I just imagine seeing like, I don't know, like a 15th century LinkedIn with somebody being service magician. I just think it sounds cool. Were any types of magic or charm sort of better represented in the records than others? Because I'm guessing it would depend on what actually made it into the records in the first place.
Yeah, which actually makes it really hard to gauge what was most common and what was most popular. So, for example, I think that probably fortune telling or future telling would be the most common type of magic practice, right? Because there were lots of ways of doing that passively. So you could just look up at the roof. If you've got crows or magpies on your roof, then that would mean that you're going to have a visitor soon. And that kind of being able to sort of tell the future in the everyday, that doesn't get written down very often because it's not particularly interesting, so people weren't writing it down. Whereas when spells go wrong, that's when people did write them down because either, it's kind of a warning to other people not to use them, or because the cunning person is being prosecuted for their activity. So we have a lot more references to people using magic to find lost and stolen goods, for example, because if you are a client who's gone to a magician to identify who stole your cow, then the reason we know about that is because the person who was identified as a thief then turns up in court and the magic gets mentioned as a result of that. So we've got a lot more references to that than we do healing magic or even some love magic and divination. But that doesn't necessarily mean it was the most common. It just means that that's what we've got the most evidence for, which makes it, yeah, difficult to gauge sometimes. But yeah, there was either way, there was definitely a lot of magic going around
Mm.
at all points.
So I know that there can be a bit of a tendency for people to think now that like witches were these innocent healers or midwives being punished by the patriarchy. And one of the things I liked about your book is the way that that shows that's not really the case, and that cunning folk were actually quite like some of them might have been a bit dodgy, but they were otherwise seen as quite helpful members of the community. So why do you think that people continue to cling to this assumption of witches as somehow being misunderstood when actually we're misunderstanding the use of the term, maybe?
Mm. Yeah, it's a really difficult one to answer quickly. But I remember being as surprised when I started this research that witches and cunning folk weren't the same people. Sort of grew up with that kind of context of kind of seeing witch persecutions as women persecutions. I sort of studied some of that at uni. And so when I went on to do my PhD in cunning magic, I genuinely expected to find that kind of thing, sort of like that persecution narrative. So when that didn't turn up, it really, really surprised me. And it definitely completely changed the way that I see that period because it's, if we just think of magic as being a power of, a sort of a supernatural special kind, but it is still just a tool that's used, it kind of makes sense that you would separate that out in your mind to people who use it for good and people who use it for bad. And priests fall into this category as well. They're also using very similar supernatural powers on a day-to-day basis. And by their society, they were seen as using them in a good way. But people who were kind of harnessing this for evil, they become witches. And so if you kind of look at the magical sort of landscape like that, as it's a tool that's relatively neutral, but then it's about how people use it, that becomes either a problem or it becomes celebrated. The whole period starts looking a lot more exciting and a lot more interesting, but also makes a lot more sense. So I think the reason that we don't always recognize this complexity is partly because witch is much more exciting and that persecution narrative is much more exciting. I mean, it's much more, it's juicier, isn't it? Like, I mean, Hollywood is going to be much more interested in producing a story about somebody who was persecuted and all the crazy things they were accused of than a cunning woman bimbling about sort of sorting out her neighbor's problems with no drama whatsoever. So I think that's like, it doesn't capture the imagination in the same way. But I think it's also because we haven't really had many people looking into this history. Feminist studies and gender studies really latched on to the witchcraft and persecution narrative. And that was kind of the main reason that we know so much about the witch trials today, because that was the stuff that was researched. So we just haven't looked enough at this other side of magic yet to really kind of see it in the round. And that's nobody's fault. Just means we need to do more research now.
Mm. I know there's one of the cases in the book, and I think it was in the healing chapter, and it's the healer who comes in to help. I think it's our neighbour's child, and she really goes through it, and really like takes on physical harm in order to try and help this girl. And you sort of think, for me, that is probably the aspect that people are thinking of, maybe, of what witches would have been like in the past, when you're actually like, well, no, that's not how people at the time would have viewed them. Because I guess anybody who was sort of like labeled as a witch would be seen as someone who's doing something malevolent, wouldn't it? It wouldn't be taking on harm to cure someone's child.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something we tend to forget. And again, you see this in Hollywood narratives all the time. Like I'm watching Mayfair Witches, which is a series that came out on BBC a couple of years ago, and like it's got that kind of narrative of a midwife who's only helping people, and then a witchfinder comes to town and sort of works his own kind of magic and just having sort of very charismatic way of speaking, and then all of a sudden her entire village turns against her and she almost gets burned. And I mean, if you just think about how that would work in reality, it wouldn't work like that. You know, if you've got somebody who's been a midwife or has been saving children for 20 years, and she's very well known for doing that, one person coming in and giving a fancy speech is not going to change everybody's hearts and minds. Meanwhile, if you do have somebody who is very antisocial, they are difficult to be around, they might even harness themselves as having a reputation of like being very magically powerful, but also not a very nice person, then you might well suspect them of witchcraft. You might expect them to be, um, I don't know, sort of like not working towards the common good. And so they're more likely to be accused as a witch eventually than somebody who's been doing good the entire time. And this is something that Puritan writers in the 16th and 17th centuries really struggled with, because Puritans thought that any kind of magic was probably working with the devil, either because they were literally calling on the devil, or because practitioners were drawing people away from God by sort of trying this other kinds of ways of fixing the world. And so they were trying to argue that cunning folk were definitely witches as well. But they kept butting up against the argument from people who actually interacted with cunning folk, where they were like, well, no, this cunning woman, she healed me. She healed my daughter. And she also found, you know, Joe Bloggs's cow. So how can that possibly be evil? And you have to sort of do quite a lot of mental acrobatics to get to the point where they actually are evil. So it wasn't, yeah, there was always this kind of struggle that even people at the time couldn't quite resolve when they were trying to brand cunning folk as witches.
It's funny because even when the cases that you reference in the book where people have taken them to court, it's nearly always been because whatever they paid for just didn't work. So it
Mm.
kind of feels more like a trade and standards issue than anything else. It's like you can imagine the reviews of that person would be terrible on Google rather than I'm going to accuse you of witchcraft because your thing didn't work. And I quite like the fact that someone's recourse was, well, I'll just sue you rather than I'm going to accuse you of witchcraft. And I think that says quite a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely does. And it just it reminded me, I think the academic version of this book that sort of was published a couple of years ago was reviewed, I think, in the Folklore Society's journal a while ago, and somebody described the book as basically a witch magazine of magic. Because that's exactly what I'm arguing. It is about sort of trading standards and almost kind of a sort of proto-capitalist approach, I suppose. You know, it's like the people offering this magic, they're meeting a demand, and they are able to sort of sell their product because it's required, but also because of their own ability to sell themselves and show that what they're doing is useful. And if people think that they've been duped or the magic doesn't work for whatever reason, yeah, they're not necessarily going to be calling that person a witch. They're going to be suing them for fraud. And you get cases where people are literally being sued for fraud. And what I really love about that is that when these cunning folk are standing in the courtrooms defending themselves, some of them say, yep, absolutely, I was lying. Sorry. But other ones also say, no, 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 I'm really good at this. It might not have worked in this particular case, but I can present loads of examples of where it worked before. And so they're defending themselves on that fraud case. They're not trying to distance themselves from the magic they've done. They're trying to convince you that actually their magic works,
Hmm.
which is a very different thing that you might expect in a courtroom at that point.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. So I think one of the questions I wanted to ask about the court proceedings then was, do you see any parallels between sort of those court proceedings involving cunning folk and the way that people approach kind of confrontation or litigation now? Like, do you think that people haven't really changed much?
I think, yeah, there's lots of ways in which people really haven't changed. The main one, I think, is that even though we apparently live in a very rational world where we're all very capable of not believing in magic, we still definitely do. And the things that we still use magic for were the things that we used in the past. So the most common uses for magic in this period, well, in the period I look at, the kind of late medieval, early modern periods, were finding lost and stolen goods, fortune telling, healing, love magic, and treasure hunting. And those five things, like prosperity spells, love magic, telling the future, like these are things that we still can draw on magic for now. So those kind of basic desires and basic fears, I don't think have gone away anywhere. But back to the litigation point, yeah, I think it it makes sense that you would turn to magic and that sort of social investigation before you would take somebody to court, for example, because obviously then as now, taking somebody to court over something, you need to have good evidence
Mhm.
against them. You need to be able to prove that in a court of law, and it's expensive. I mean, people had to pay their own court fees back then, and you still have to pay, for certain court fees now. So you'd really go to court as last resort. So having some kind of mediator in the community that can smooth the way between you kind of meeting some kind of reconciliation or just getting your stolen item back with very little fuss would definitely be preferable. And the fact that you'd go to somebody who has good reputation and somebody you could trust makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
You could go to local priest who would also have a lot of social capital, or you could go to the cunning person who probably wouldn't charge as much, to be
Yeah.
honest. So yeah.
So did any cunning folk sort of use the number of accusations against them as like marketing? Because I can imagine there being a certain type of person who'd be like, look at how many times I've been to court about this, and it kind of using it as an opportunity to sort of sell themselves. Was anybody as bizarre as that?
Um, Not directly that I can think of. But there are definitely lots of people who, when they stand up in court, would complain bitterly about how many clients they have. So there's a brilliant guy, his name's William Wycherley, and if I could have one dinner date from history, it would be him because I he gives this very, very long confession to the London church courts. And there's no reason for him to do it. He's not being subjected to torture. He's not going to be particularly punished, but for some reason he goes on for three quite long pages about all of his magical activity ever. And at one point, he says that it's hard for him to even stir out of doors because his services are so in demand that he just can't leave his own house without being sort of bothered constantly. Um, and he also says that he's been practicing magic for 30 years and he's been very successful. He sort of name drops other people he's worked with. And so I guess that kind of the fact that he says all of this and he would have said it in an open court could well have been an advert for yeah, his activities.
I suppose it's a good way of getting it written down for you as well to actually do it in court.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, that is one of my theories. Like maybe he just thought of this as his opportunity to have his own biography.
I like that. And this is the thing as well that I find fascinating about the book, the number of male cunning folk, because obviously there's usually that kind of gendered assumption that all this would be sort of female led. And I think it's I've come across Peter Banks a few times when I've been doing things, obviously with him being in Newcastle as well. But he's such a character. He's the kind of person like, why hasn't he got a Netflix series?
Yes.
So why do you think that people have just overlooked male cunning folk? Or is it just that because it's still quite a new area of research, people haven't just really got to them yet?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think that it's definitely one of those things that suffered from the overemphasis on witchcraft. And men who were accused of witchcraft have also kind of suffered for this. You don't get many people, well, many stories about male witches, and you don't get many stories about male cunning folk either because it doesn't fit our expectations. I mean, I guess the exception to that is the Crucible, where you've obviously got John Proctor and his sort of very dramatic fall from grace. But generally, yeah, you don't get that kind of thing because people aren't really interested in that. There's not very much story there unless you start looking at them as individuals. As you say, Peter Banks is a fascinating guy. He had a very successful business writing up magical contracts and seemed to have had very, strong influences across the Newcastle area. Like that's awesome and that's fascinating. I think it should definitely be put back into history. Um, but we do need to let go of our attachment to magic being a solely female thing. I think in order to make that leap. So yeah, I hope it happens. I'd like it to.
So just saying about the magical contracts, because I've mentioned them on the podcast before, and one of the ones I mentioned was the idea that you would sell sailors like a lease for like a year that would kind of protect them from drowning at sea, and then obviously after a year they would presumably go back and buy another one. So in a way you feel like it's kind of an early subscription service. So it's like you know we get all of this software as a subscription now. Started with Peter Banks. Would that also necessitate a degree of literacy on the part of the male cunning folk? Because obviously, when you look at a lot of what the women are producing, it sort of seems to be slightly different in the sense that they're maybe using things like the seven shares and so on, whereas the men are then writing things down. Does that play a role in it, do you think?
Yeah, I think it does. I think even though there's a pretty even gender split between men and women practicing this kind of magic and selling this kind of magic, the kinds of spells they do varies very much by gender. And as you say, I think that's because of the different styles of education they would have received. So you do get male cunning folk who are using the sieve and shears, but yeah, if you do have somebody who's got quite a good sort of ability to read and write, possibly has speaks some Latin, maybe even some Hebrew or some Arabic, then that's firstly going to be quite exotic for their clients and going to look a lot more impressive. And so it's not particularly surprising that you would take advantage of that if you were able to sell those kinds of spells, which are just a little bit more impressive. And yeah, as a result, you're probably going to have more men doing those because they could go to university potentially, and quite a few sort of men who went to university for the first couple of years to train as priests and then dropped out would then sort of go on to do magic instead as their side business. Um, so yeah, and that's just not an opportunity that was available for women. That said, as you get into the later 16th and early 17th centuries, because of the explosion of printing and the increase in literacy that that provided, you do see more women using more complex forms of magic. They might not have been able to write, but they would have been able to read. And being able to read meant that they could access sort of guides on astrology, for example. And so you start seeing women using astrological ideas or astrological terms in their spells. So yeah, there's a bit of democratization that happens, which is quite nice to see. But
Mm.
yeah, there is still that gendered split.
Yeah. So where did you actually find all of this stuff about the cunning folk? Like, is it just court records or do they appear in other records as well?
Yeah, all over the place. The church court records were my main source because, well, because the church is interested in stuff and bloody nosy. So if somebody is um, causing some kind of disruption in their community or taking away the priest's business, which is sometimes what cunning folk were doing, then you're going to find most information about them there. But obviously, that's a very kind of accusatory, persecutory sort of stage, and that wasn't exactly what I wanted to be looking at. And also because cunning folk are so useful and generally quite uncontroversial, is that a word? Yeah. Um, they don't appear there as often as I would like, I suppose. So you don't get a well-rounded image of who cunning folk are. So I expanded the search. I looked at a lot of plays from the 16th and 17th centuries, looked at a lot of kind of folk tales and kind of Arthurian legends for the earlier period, the kind of 13th through to 15th centuries. Um, I also looked at recipes and diaries, medical texts as well, because there's lots of magic that gets sort of woven into medical texts. And, you don't tend to think of surgeons as being cunning folk, but they would definitely incorporate a lot of spells. And so you kind of have to wonder, where do we actually sort of draw that line? So yeah, just really, really varied range of sources. And I think between them all, you do get quite a good idea of the role that magic played in society. Even if you can't necessarily get a good view of one particular person, you can still get a kind of impression of the period from it.
Yeah, it was interesting when you mentioned about the plays there, and they've got that section at the end where you're talking about the way that some of the plays, because of when they were written, they might have like one good magical practitioner and one bad one, or there's some kind of discussion as part of the play where they're then talking about is magic morally good or lawful evil or whatever. And I think it's one of those things where you forget that obviously plays would have to in some way reflect people's beliefs back to them, and therefore that actually becomes quite a good source of information about them. But it did also make me wonder at that point, is that where we then draw our assertions from these different plays, particularly Shakespeare? And is that why we then sometimes get it wrong because we're looking at something without maybe that nuance and context around it?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great observation. Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I think it's true today, and I think it was true then. People see what they want to see in media, even when you do have two sides or even three sides presented in a story. You're still going to remember the one that agrees most with what you think. Um, and so I think, yeah, our interpretation of a lot of Shakespearean plays and other plays from the period do we have a confirmation bias going on when we read them. And I think you see that very strongly with Macbeth. Obviously, it's like one of the most famous plays where you've got lots of witches running around doing their things, and they're clearly evil, and it brings down the downfall of everything, and it's they're bad people. But they're also not bad people in many ways. They don't actually cause the thoughts that are in Macbeth's head. They don't really set in motion a lot of that. What happens. Like they prompt it, but they don't cause it. And the witches in the first versions of Macbeth were never actually called witches. And when Macbeth was first performed on stage, people in the audience didn't call them witches either. They called them spirits or fairies. And I think that's quite important, as you say, like we've missed that context, and we've now got such a clear idea in our head of what a witch is. When we read Macbeth, we see a witch when that's not necessarily what it was ever intended to be. So yeah, we're seeing our own beliefs and expectations as much as we're seeing the past, and sometimes we're not. We tend to forget the past within these stories sometimes, I think, as well.
Yeah, and I think that's when I'm thinking of things like even when the fairies are then using magic and like a Midsummer Night's Dream and it all goes horribly wrong, at least it can be undone again. But I suppose it is that it is the moral sometimes more just like just don't mess with it rather than anything else. It kind of feels like rather than condemning it, it's more I don't know, my impression anyway is where it's kind of presented as this could go horribly wrong.
Yes. Yeah,
Um,
and I think. Oh, sorry.
no, so you go.
No, I was basically gonna agree with you. I think and again, it's about humans. A lot of this stuff, it's about how humans use magic and the hubris that they bring with it. And if you have good intentions, then normally it works out. If you have bad intentions or you're just hopelessly naive, then it's not going to work out. So yeah, I think that's an important part of it.
Mm. I think the other one you mentioned as well is that Dr. Faustus, and
Mm.
I always take from that not that you shouldn't try and make deals with the devil. It's more the fact that like he overreaches himself. So again, it's more kind of about like know your limits, and that's possibly not the moral that Marlowe had in mind when he wrote it.
Maybe not, but Marlowe was also very into this kind of stuff. So, maybe he was using it as an opportunity to explore the kinds of concepts that were out there, and then sort of made it more palatable to a conservative audience. Or maybe he, you know, was aware of the many, many, many warnings that come with this stuff. As like if you're going to do it safely.
Mm.
um, I actually also went to a paper a couple of years ago by a lawyer who was talking about Dr. Faustus and basically saying he signed a really bad contract. He should have had a lawyer involved, and if he had, this wouldn't have been such a nightmare.
Oh, that's an excellent moral to take away from that. Oh, I like that. That is quite funny. Because that's the thing, I think, particularly obviously with, the devil then sort of coming into sort of Dr. Faustus, obviously the devil doesn't really seem to appear in Cunning Folk Magic. He seems to be completely irrelevant to all of that. Is that true?
Yeah, I think so most of the time. So again, it gets kind of wibbly depending on who you ask in this period. Cunning folk often, for example, work with fairies. Fairies, as we discussed before we started recording, are terrifying. And they are also very morally neutral. Sometimes they're more on the devilish side, sometimes they're more on the angelic side. So people who were against cunning folk would have said that they're using demons by using fairies. Um, Obviously most cunning folk wouldn't want to touch that kind of thing, and they would genuinely think that they were using fairies. So the devil narrative definitely is in there, but I think, as I say, most people who were practicing this kind of magic were either frauds just trying to make some money, or they genuinely believed it and genuinely thought that they were doing a good thing. So yeah, if you think you're doing the right thing, you're unlikely to be drawing on the devil to do that. So yeah, in that sense, I guess, yeah, he is pretty irrelevant.
Yeah. I know you mentioned someone earlier, but did you end up with a favorite cunning person while you were sort of writing about them?
Um, I mean, I love them all so much. They live rent free in my head all the time. So yeah, I think I do love William Wycherley. I think he is mad, and I want to hang out with him. The case that you mentioned before, actually, of the the woman who sort of put her life on the line to save the sick child. Her name was Elizabeth Page. I love her as well. She's so brave. She's also quite arrogant. You know, after she manages to save this child, she then tells everybody that this child is basically her daughter because she gave her life to save hers. Which I think would probably be quite annoying to be around. But, you know, she clearly really dedicated to her work and was very dedicated to saving lives. I think that's very brave and very special. So yeah, she's quite special to me.
I also enjoyed the story of I can't remember her name, but the cunning person who came to try and, oh, who was it? It was one of the upper class who was poisoned, I think, possibly. Or she worked out he was poisoned, and then the doctors turn up and can do nothing. And then eventually they're like, oh yeah, no, she was right all along. And you do kind of think like that is a bittersweet thing to admit at that point that the cunning
Mhm.
person knows more than you do. Um, so I thought
Yeah.
that was quite funny. But do you think that everyone focuses on gender all the time, which obviously I can understand why, is there also a class dynamic at play as well? So like I was quite surprised to see how many wealthy people were hiring service magicians, particularly to then acquire more wealth. So is it one of those things as well where maybe they kind of fly under the radar a little bit, particularly where wealthy people are concerned because they don't want to admit that they're consorting with the lower classes?
Yeah, I think there is definitely an element of that. And I think that class, as you say, I can understand why gender has been given so much attention, but I think class is as important, if not more, an important factor when it comes to cunning magic. Um, yeah, so the different classes definitely use magic differently. As you say, the upper classes would use it for wealth acquisition or to kind of just improve their status. There are so many spells to get into favor with the monarch or somebody higher up the social ladder than you. Um, and yeah, I think it's fascinating actually, because whereas people in the lower classes, they would kind of call on a cunning person when they needed them, you know, sort of like on an ad hoc basis. Because the upper classes had quite a lot of money, they would actually keep a cunning person or a service magician on retainer, so that they would become their own personal magician. Um, and that would kind of have two elements to it. Like, firstly, it means that you know you've got somebody who can help you out, you know, whenever you need. But it also means that they're almost sort of sworn to secrecy, and they've got that sort of that discreetness or that you might want from somebody, especially if you're plotting to kill the monarch or if you're plotting to, you know, sort of embarrass somebody else in public so that you can gain their status. So, yeah, cunning folk are treated differently by the different classes. They also probably would have been of different classes themselves. So, a nobleman would probably employ somebody who did have a university education, and therefore was probably male because they'd probably have better access to better spells, basically, and they'd offer their services for for higher fees. So yeah, they'd probably be using somebody from a different background, according to their status. That's not always the case. I mentioned what's her name, Mary Woods, in the introduction to the book, and she probably well, she was a woman, so she wouldn't have gone to university, definitely. But she also probably wouldn't have had a hugely good education because she was from the lower classes. But she did a lot of hobnobbing with the aristocracy and was very important for a lot of their sort of devious plans. So yeah, it's not a hard and fast rule, but yeah, there is that class comes into it in so many different ways. And I think also aristocrats might well have been more prepared to protect their magicians when they needed them, but also more likely to throw them under the bus when they didn't need them.
Mm,
So yeah, it would be quite dangerous, I think, to be a cunning person in an aristocrat's employ sometimes.
yeah. And that made me think about obviously all the period dramas because they're nearly always about the upper classes. And you never really, that I can think of, see cunning folk depicted in them.
Mhm.
And do you think that if there were, that would actually add anything to our understanding of a period?
Yeah, I think it really would. I think it would help break down this idea that believing in magic is a hysterical idea. I don't know, I would hope that it would make people a little bit more humble and a little bit less patronizing towards the past. I think we've got this idea that just because we're alive now, we're better than people who are dead, which is obviously not true. Like the reason we're here is because they survived and thrived in some cases. So re-injecting the full scope of beliefs that people embraced, I think is quite an important part of just being better people and sort of understanding the past a bit better. Um, yeah, and I think it would also break down some of that narrative of witchcraft persecution. You know, I have no problem with people looking at the past and sort of seeing the atrocities that were enacted, and then learning from them. But if we are going to learn from them, then we need to better understand them. And so, yeah, I think the witchcraft narrative of, it's just, women being persecuted for being good people, um, needs to be made a bit more complicated. And I think if we had more sort of benevolent magic in the narratives, we have a better understanding of that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, because there tends to be that thing that I've seen where anytime there's any sort of sense of like a particular group's being persecuted, there's a particular contingent online who will always jump in and talk about their fallen witch sisters, referring to people from earlier centuries who were executed for witchcraft. And you think, I understand and I agree wholeheartedly with honouring these people who were a victim of a system rigged against them. But to assume that if you're a modern witchcraft practitioner, you have anything in common with these people, to me, always just seems to kind of miss the point somewhat. Because you
Mm.
think, I'm pretty sure those people who were accused would absolutely not have seen themselves as witches. So it sort of seems like a bit of an odd narrative. And I think, yeah, people now are probably closer to the cunning folk who were getting sued for fraud.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And it does become a bit of a catch-22 at that point. Either they are being, witches are being accused and prosecuted for something that was impossible because magic isn't real, or they were being accused and prosecuted for practicing magic which is real. And you can't really have it both ways. And if we accept that, they were doing things that they believed in, and that they were, the magic worked in some way, which I think a lot of magical practitioners today, obviously, they do believe that magic works, um, then you need to accept that maybe some of them were doing the things that they were accused of, at which point it doesn't become a completely foundless accusation. Whereas if you're saying that, they couldn't possibly have been doing the things they were accused of, then you can't believe in magic. Like, yeah, you can't have your cake and eat it with this kind of thing. It becomes a bit of a uh, yeah, well, what's the word I'm looking for? Fallacy. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just I know whenever I've seen sort of people like say for example go to like Pendle Hill and then sort of again sort of trying to sort of connect with like these fallen witch sisters and things and I'm always kind of like
Mm.
right and again I think it sort of almost feels a little bit like people are trying to insert themselves into a history that actually they're not related to, if that makes
Mm.
sense.
And don't fully understand, yeah, as you say, the the people especially because it wasn't just women who were accused at Pendle. They still would have seen themselves as Christian. They're not sort of tapped into some kind of pagan cult or anything like that. They might have seen themselves as lapsed Christians, but they would definitely have still seen themselves in that light, and they would have. I don't know. There's so much about their lives that don't fit with our modern lives. And to assume that we're the same, it means that we don't understand them well enough.
Hmm. Now, I must admit, I do love the fact that magic studies is now a thing. And it's one of those things where, because I did a history of art and film, I always kind of go, oh, I wish I'd known about magic studies. What do you think that this particular approach to history can tell us that other histories maybe overlook? Because that's what I love about all these different branches of history. All of them kind of cover a different thing. And then you put them together and realize it's difficult to understand what was going on. So what's magic studies like USP, if that's not a weird question?
That was a great question. Um, what is its USP? I mean, I think it's got several, to be fair. And I'm about to swear, but I think one of them is that, it just basically it reinserts the weird shit into history. And I think that's a good thing. Because economic history, it tends to assume that we're all very rational beings who do rational things all the time, and that's obviously not true. And so kind of recognizing that humans are messy, I think is quite a special thing that magic studies embraces. Um, I think it's also, I mean, the reason that I love it, and I think of myself as more of a social historian than I do a magic historian. But the reason I look at it through magic is because magic unlocks so many different pathways into, the past. Um, like the fact that I'm able to look at the fears and anxieties of the aristocracy as well as the priorities of shepherds is because I'm looking at it through the lens of magic. So I think magic kind of it does let you tap into so many different branches of history in a history from below kind of way, which I really like. But also in quite as I guess almost like a non-judgmental way as well. Whereas I think a lot of history you can sort of look at it from above and go, oh, I can sort of map it out and now I understand history. You do have to be quite humble to look at magic in the past because you really need to understand where somebody was coming from and their internal psychology to an extent to really get the magic that they were using. So it encourages, I think, I hope, a more nuanced view of history and mostly from a social perspective, but lots of other ones as well. I mean, we talked about proto-capitalism earlier in the sale of magic. Like it can work with economic history as well, depending on how you use it. So it's really versatile and weird. I guess just
We do like the weird here at Fabulous Folklore. I was just wondering if there's almost a way of kind of this is probably something that I'll have to think about myself, but like almost magic as a technology as well,
Mhm.
and bringing it in is in that again. That's bringing us back to the software as a subscription thing, really. Because I think obviously it's a bit like people hire experts to do something for them, and obviously what is the difference between I don't know hiring somebody to uh set up your computer for you and then somebody who's going to find lost objects using
Mhm.
something you don't quite understand.
Mhm.
Obviously, well, I made a comment about Microsoft just before there. A lot of, I suppose, technology works like magic, so until it doesn't.
Mhm.
The other thing
Mhm.
I was going to ask is obviously Marion Gibson's been on the podcast before and talking about her book about the witch trials, and she told me now this was last year that you were working on a project together.
Mhm.
So how is that going, or how did that go, depending on whether it was finished or not?
Yeah, we've got 2 months of the project left, so it's almost done. It was a 3-year project overall, looking at ironically, the witch hunts in the east of England, since sort of 1640s, the kind of Matthew Hopkins witch hunts. And I think it's gone really well. It's been, uh, it was a bit of a gear shift for me, I guess, looking from sort of cunning folk where I'm like, no, 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 it's not witchcraft, it is magic. To oh, these people are accused of witchcraft. What's going on here then? But it's been absolutely fascinating. I mean, one of the aims of the project was to look at the people who are accused of witchcraft and their accusers like in the round instead of just looking at those 2 intense years of witch hunting. What were their lives like beforehand? A lot of them also survived. What were their lives like afterwards? um and it's been difficult, not gonna lie. There's both a ridiculous number of sources available and not the right ones at any point. So it's been hard to kind of track people's stories over the well, up to 80 years that they've lived. But I think it's given us a much better insight into what sorts of things were going on and what people's priorities were, and just how important the context was. I think it does go back to that question of whether these are people that we can relate to now or not. Um, they were all Christian, and one of the things that surprises me so much, I've been looking at the families of witches in Cambridgeshire, and it sounds daft, but all of them are written down in the parish registers as having been baptized and having been given Christian burials and having got married. And the fact that they live in that very conventional life before they're accused and that they do diligently baptize their children, they're not being prosecuted for not baptizing their children, that shows how much they were sort of sitting in this Christian paradigm for most of their lives. But what was also going on in Cambridgeshire at this time was that the fens were being drained and enclosed. And that environmental devastation and the onset of poverty that provoked, I think, was very, very important for the witch trials. Not because it was people from above persecuting witches, but actually because of the massive tensions that local people were being put under that caused these big fallings out that 10 years later eventually led to people being accused of witchcraft. So I think yeah, it's been a fascinating project. We're still working on all of the outputs. We've got lots of articles to write, and Marion's almost finished writing the book about it now, which is pretty great. Um, but yeah, it's also taught us about how different people were back then, but also there's definitely lessons for us now about the world that we live in and how intolerant people can become when they're scared. Which I think is also a message that we can find from magic in general, like we're all little bald apes just trying to get through the day.
Yeah, and I think the idea of people becoming more intolerant, it's like, look around.
Mhm.
That's something else I think we could probably learn quite a lot from. So is that what you're working on now then, or is there anything else that you've got in the pipeline?
So that's what I'm working on now, as I say, for the next couple of months at least. After that, I'm currently working on the idea of a video game that is set in the 17th century Fens, where you get to play a cunning woman who goes around and sort of helps her clients deal with things and kind of investigates like neighborhood dramas and solves mysteries. So yeah, that will hopefully be my summer. Should be
I would
quite fun.
100% play that.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, the minute where they solve mysteries, I was like, "Ooh, tell me more." Uh, so, where can people find you online if they want to come and sort of like find out more about you or anything like that?
So I have a website which is I find mildly embarrassing, but there you go. So there's a contact form on there. The website is tabithastanmore.co.uk. You can also find me on Instagram at Tabitha Stanmore, or on Blue Sky at Magic Not Witches, because I made that when I was doing my PhD.
Oh, cool. Obviously, I'll put like links and things below for the show
Thanks.
notes because obviously then people can just click on stuff and that's fine. Um, but no, I hope people have gotten quite a lot out of that because I know I got quite evangelical once I read the book. Because obviously, as we mentioned before we started recording, I had fallen for that narrative of oh, witches were just these persecuted women and patriarchy and all that kind of thing. And then the more I read into it, the more I was like, oh, it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think it's nice that there's more of these sort of books coming out and things and actually going, yeah, it's more interesting than that. And it's not as black and white as I think people like to make it. So I'm glad that you've done the book. And which apparently Malcolm Gaskill described as a brilliant book written with verve and wit, according to the front cover. So that's high praise from him. So I think, yeah, I hope that people sort of go away and look into Cunning Folk a bit more because they deserve their own Netflix series because some of them are really, really bizarre.
Definitely. And if there are any producers out there who want to chat to me about that, I would love to do it. So,
You never know. Manifesting.
yes.
Well, thank you very much. It's been lovely chatting to you.
Thank you.
Well, hello there. I just wanted to do this quick review of this book, Cunning Folk, Life in the Era of Practical Magic by Tabitha Stanmore. And put simply, I really enjoyed it. I will say in advance, I did actually buy it myself, so it's not a review copy. I bought it on the recommendation of Marion Gibson, and I was not disappointed. And obviously, I have interviewed Tabitha on my podcast as well. And basically, it's a really good introduction to what Cunning Folk actually are because I think that there has been a lot of discussion about witchcraft and witches, and people sometimes conflate this idea of like white witches and negative witches, which isn't really correct. And the ones that you might consider good witches were actually probably more likely cunning folk, also known as service magicians, which I really think is a term that needs to come back into common use. So these are the people in your community that you would go to and you would hire them to do something for you. That might be helping you to find a lost item. It might be helping you with a health complaint of some description. It might be helping you to find a partner. It could be trying to get wealth and influence and things like that. All sorts of things come under the heading of this kind of magic. And that is the thing, it is magic, it is not witchcraft. So invariably it doesn't really involve talking to demons or bringing familiars in or anything like that. It is divination often, and particularly in the case of fortune telling, but it can also be charms and things like that. And the book's divided into the different types of thing that people would use this magic for. So you've got one about like how to use cunning magic to win a trial, as in like a legal trial, how to use it obviously to find love, how to use it to gain wealth and all that kind of thing. What's really cool is it does cover how different classes also approach service magicians. So this was not just ordinary people like you and I hiring them. This is also like the aristocracy also hiring them as well, but obviously for very different reasons and for very different types of magic as well. It's really interesting, it's really readable, and it really digs into who these people were and what they did. And the main reason that we know about a lot of them is because obviously some of them were taken to court because what they promised to do didn't work. Now, there's various reasons why that might be the case, but it does go to show that people would be far more likely to try and sue someone if this kind of magic didn't work rather than issue an accusation of witchcraft. So I have seen a review of it on Goodreads where somebody got very annoyed because of the fact that they were like, oh, this book ignores all of the healers who were actually accused of witchcraft, which just goes to show how valuable this book actually is, because so many people continue to believe this incorrect narrative that a particular type of person was being persecuted for witchcraft when that wasn't really necessarily the case. And it also irritated me that somebody who clearly had understood witchcraft, perhaps from a slightly more New Age perspective, thought that they knew more than an actual qualified historian who's looked at the actual historical record about cunning people. It's a really interesting topic, and I really hope that more people take an interest in cunning folk, because there's some characters in here. Some of the things that people did. I've talked about Peter Banks on the podcast before. I don't know how he hasn't got a Netflix series yet. So there's some really interesting characters. There's some really interesting examples of cases where people have used cunning folk for whatever reason. And it's just a really well written, interesting book that I think more people should read. So if you're interested in the history of witchcraft, the history of magic, or the early modern period more generally, then this is definitely a book that I think that you'll enjoy. So it gets a massive 5 out of 5 for me, or a 10 out of 10, whichever one. I haven't really picked a review scale yet, and I highly recommend it. And you can pick up a copy through the Fabulous Folklore bookshop on bookshop.org. Yes, I do get a portion of the affiliate sales for that, but I wouldn't recommend it if I didn't think it was an excellent book. So please do feel free to check that out as well. But otherwise, highly recommended from me. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.